amateur boxer once said, "Sport has the power to change the world." And when it came to changing the world, this guy was the ultimate professional. At the 1995 Rugby World Cup, Nelson Mandela brought a divided nation together. But as great as he was, the South African president wasn't the first or last to make history through sport. From forgotten champions who broke new ground, to the greatest gathering of humanity the world has ever known, sport has shaped our world in more ways than you might think. I'm heading to Victoria, arguably Australia's most sports-mad state. 70 years ago, a game was invented here that helped save a crucial alliance from tearing two nations apart. In 1943, a war within a war was taking place in Australia. With the arrival of hundreds of thousands of US soldiers, tensions broke out between the well-paid and well-mannered Americans and the local troops, who felt the visitors were stealing their women. Things came to a head when an all-out brawl erupted in Melbourne, involving more than 3,000 men. Something had to be done. A series of football matches was proposed to help bridge the divide. But which nation's code would be played? Hi guys, thanks a lot for saying you'd help in this. In the 1940s, when there were about 30,000 Americans in Melbourne, and they used to look at the Australian game, and they got really excited by it. They loved it. Whereas when the Australians looked at gridiron, no. Yeah. Incredibly slow, they found it. And as some kind of goodwill gesture, the two armies got together and decided that they would make up a game that combined the best skills of both games. When you got your kit on, should we have a go at it?
Yeah, sure. I'll do.
Right, off you go then, out there. And so, Estas was born. Ost for Australia and US for the United States. We're going to start by playing to your strengths. Dave, could you go over there? And I'd like you to kick the ball to Denham. Denham, you'll be over there, OK? The game was based on Australian rules. Beautiful. But there was one big difference. To even up the Aussie prowess in kicking, gridiron-style passing was permitted. The Australians could outkick the Americans and the Yanks could outpass the Aussies. Oh, nearly killed the cameraman. Thank you very much. But together it was dynamite. A visiting US war correspondent wrote, "The result is a cyclonic, wide-open, high-scoring combination of soccer, basketball, and aerial bombardment." Of the 5 games played in 1943, the US won 3-2. But the alliance was the real winner. With the help of Estas, respect and understanding was restored. But that's not the first time sport has successfully bridged an international divide. My time travels are now taking me back over 2,000 years to another sporting event that was once lost in time, but would eventually bring the world together like no other. In 776 BC, a competition began in ancient Greece that would change the history of sport forever. Those sporting games were, of course, the ancient Olympics. As now, they were held every 4 years, and they were taken very seriously. So seriously that they built one of the 7 wonders of the world to prove it, an enormous statue of Zeus, the supreme god of the Greek pantheon. A 13-metre-high gold and ivory statue, complete with its own temple. The ancient games were held in Zeus's honour. They were a homage to his most sacred place, Olympia. There's an echo of those ancient times, even today, right here in the word gymnasium. It comes from the Greek word gymnos, which means naked. It really was all about the body beautiful. Exercising naked was said to be a tribute to the gods. Combat sports played a key role in the ancient games. There was boxing, wrestling, and a particularly violent sport called pancration. Closest thing today is MMA, or mixed martial arts. Greece was at war with most of her neighbours, so tests of a warrior's fighting skills was something to be celebrated. In fact, the most famous warrior of all was called Milo, and he was a wrestler. He won at Olympia 5 times on the trot, and there's loads of stories about him, but the most telling story about him is to do with his death. He was wandering through a forest when he came across a tree that had been newly cut down, and it was ready to be split. The wedges had been placed in it, and he thought, I don't need a hammer or an axe, I can split that with my bare hands. And he stuck his fingers in the crack, and the wedges flew out, and his fingers were trapped in the crack. And he was eaten that night by wild animals because he couldn't get out. And I suppose the moral of that story is you might be really strong, but it doesn't necessarily mean you get it all up here. The Greeks weren't the only nation who loved their sport and all the pageantry that went with it. The Romans did too. But their interest would eventually lead to the undoing of the ancient games. Greece was gradually absorbed into the Roman Empire as it marched its way across Europe. Roman beliefs started to take hold in the new Greco-Roman world, and this eventually brought an end to the games, as it was now considered inappropriate to hold them in honour of a pagan god like Zeus. The statue of Zeus was destroyed, Olympia fell, the games were banned. For a long time, it seemed that the Olympic Games and its ideals were dead and buried. To find out how they came back, I need to travel 1,500 years into the future. It's the 1850s, and in the small Shropshire town of Much Wenlock, a revolutionary movement began that would lead to the rebirth of the modern games. Its founder was local GP William Penny Brooks. He wanted to encourage young working men to exercise their minds, so he started an agricultural reading society which used to meet up there in those rooms above the Corn Exchange there. They could listen to lectures on botany, on the arts, on music, but Brooks wanted to have some kind of physical activity because he was a passionate believer in muscular Christianity, which advocated fit bodies and sound minds. So he started an Olympian class to promote the moral, physical and intellectual improvement of the inhabitants of the town and neighbourhood of Wenlock by the encouragement of outdoor recreation and by the award of prizes annually at public meetings for skill in athletic exercise.
Good morning and welcome to the 125th Wenlock Olympian Games.
The first Wenlock Olympian Games were held in 1850, and apart from the two world wars and their aftermath, they've been held every year since then. The original event was especially notable because it was the first organised games ever to be held for working class people. One of the favourite pastimes of bored aristocrats was to get a lot of athletic young men together, race them and bet on the outcome, a bit like we do on horses and dogs today. Brooks hated that kind of competition. As far as he was concerned, people ought to race for the love of the sport, not for the love of money. Helen, you must know more about these games than anyone else around here. Did Brooks encounter much opposition?
Oh, yes. It didn't come easily. If you think about the 1850s, the Riot Act was still in place. 12 people on a street corner would have constituted a riot, and that was an excuse for the ruling class there to remove them.
And Brooks actually succeeded?
Oh, he did, against all the odds.
How did he do that?
By organising a games which were for the working men that had rules and regulations. He offered them a prize, a medal at the end. Who's going to give a working man a prize for running? It was extraordinary. It was quite exceptional.
But even as those athletes were running their way into the annals of Olympic history, Brooks was focusing on the next stage of his plan, which was to expand the Games to other towns in Shropshire, which he did over the next few years. And just like with the Olympic Games today, people were prepared to pay to have the Games held in their town because they considered it to be such an honour. So places like Wellington and Shrewsbury joined Much Wenlock in becoming part of Brooks's dream, which was beginning to expand beyond all recognition. In 1866, 10,000 spectators and competitors went to Crystal Palace, built for the Great Exhibition of 1851, to witness the first National Olympian Association Games. The modern Olympics were a step closer. Alongside his Olympic ambition, Brooks also wanted to encourage sport among school children. This brought him into contact with someone who held the key to unlocking his Olympic dream. His name was Baron Pierre de Coubertin, a French aristocrat recently arrived in London. He too was passionate about the power and benefits of sport. Brooks invited him to Much Wenlock as the guest of honour at the Wenlock Olympian Games in 1890. Brooks realised that as he was growing old, he'd need to pass on the baton of his Olympic quest. So he shared all his ideas and methods with de Coubertin. They talked long into the night. De Coubertin was inspired by what he learned and determined to make the dream a reality. 4 years later, at the 1894 Congress of the Sorbonne, the foundations of the modern Olympics were laid. Sadly, Brooks died in December 1895, just 4 months before the launch of the inaugural Games of the modern era in Athens. For nearly a century, Brooks's part in the rebirth of the modern Games was all but forgotten. But in 1994, Juan Antonio Samaranch, the president of the International Olympic Committee, came to Much Wenlock to lay a wreath on his grave to commemorate Brooks's place in modern Olympic history. His dream had become reality. Over the decades, the Olympic movement had brought people together in ways William Penny Brooks could only have dreamt of. But not everyone has always been included. At the start of the modern games, it was women who had to fight to take part. De Coubertin declared female athletes were impractical, uninteresting, unaesthetic and incorrect, and sought to ban them. But that didn't stop one talented woman from making Olympic history. To meet her, I need to time travel forward just a few years to the early years of the 20th century, when her legend began. I've come to Sydney, Australia, to the shores of the Parramatta River, where a forgotten Olympic champion once trained around 1910. The great Australian swimmer Fanny Durack, who won Olympic gold and broke a dozen world records and suffered terrible sex discrimination during her professional life, she used to power her way up and down here in training. In an age when women rarely went swimming, Fanny Durack was unique. After nearly drowning as a child, she taught herself to swim. And she soon got the hang of it, winning at the first ever swimming carnival for ladies in 1906. Part of the reason for Fanny's success was that she was the first woman to use the Australian crawl. It had been developed in Sydney a few years earlier by the pioneers of Australian swimming, the Cavill family. And it was them who decided that they wanted to prove to Australia and the world that the crawl was such a good stroke.
They wanted to prove that you didn't have to kick the legs. You could merely trail the legs behind you and you would go faster than the current stroke, which was the side stroke at that time.
So how did the Cavills set out to prove that the crawl was so great?
They demonstrated on a race they set up. They wanted Thomas Cavill to have his legs tied and to race against the orthodox side stroker. And guess who won?
Well, you will see who won right now. Right, we've got two volunteers here, Alan and Scott. You're starting to look a bit cold, Alan.
It's very cold.
Well, you're going to be Sid Davis,
okay.
Right? So you're the guy who did the trudgeon.
Yep.
So you put one arm...
Side strike.
Yeah, and your feet?
Scissor kick.
Exactly. Scott, you're going to be Tums Cavill. So you are the guy who's doing something nobody's ever seen around here before, the crawl. Except in order to demonstrate quite how efficient it is, Tums lashed his feet together. So if you could wrap that round your legs. Gentlemen, ready, steady, go!
Getting nothing from his legs.
Here's the finishing line here. Come here. Oh. Alan, you're lost. But that was quite impressive, wasn't it?
That's right, and that's what it was. It impressed the swimmers of the time. It impressed them that they had to get to the crawl stroke.
By 1912, Fanny Durack was the fastest female swimmer in the country, which should have guaranteed her passage to the Stockholm Olympics. But there was a problem. Just 4 months out from the Games, an Australian ban on mixed bathing threatened to stop her competing. But after much public outcry, the authorities finally saw sense. The ban was overturned, and Fanny was on her way to making Olympic history. On the 12th of July 1912, in the 100 metres final, Fanny Durack used the Australian crawl to devastating effect. In the first female swimming race ever held at the Olympics, she won the gold. And what's more, she made a new 100-metre freestyle world record. It wouldn't be broken for another 8 years. Fanny's success inspired a whole new generation of girls to take up swimming. A fantastic example of how sport can inspire social change. But sometimes it happens the other way round. On my next time travel, I'm going back 30 years to find out how a social revolution led to one of the great rivalries in sport. I've come to Rupert's Wood Mansion in Victoria, the birthplace of one of the strangest trophies in sporting history, cricket's Ashes. It started out as a joke. After Australia had beaten England at her own game in 1882, Reginald Brooks wrote a mock obituary. In affectionate memory of English cricket, which died at the Oval, the body will be cremated and the ashes taken to Australia. I always thought that after the Oval match was over, the bails and the stumps were burned and put in some sort of pot, and ever after, Australia and England played for the Ashes. But I was totally wrong. The Ashes were created here. This is Rupert's Wood in Victoria. And in the 1880s, it was the home of Sir William Clark. And he'd met the England team when they were coming over to Australia on the boat in that same year, 1882. And he invited them here for Christmas. And they played a game of cricket. It was only a friendly. No one was really counting the score. But after it was over, the local ladies picked up the bails. They threw them onto the fire. Then they put them in a terracotta perfume pot, and that was the beginning of the struggle for probably the most unprepossessing trophy in the history of world sport. The reason Australia could even field a cricket team was that a remarkable change had taken place in Australian society, and very few people today know about it. In the middle of the 19th century, it suddenly dawned on the Australian worker that he was valuable. There was a skilled labour shortage in the cities. A world away from the smog of England's Industrial Revolution, Australia's workforce began to organise. It started when a bunch of stonemasons kicked off. They said that in the Australian heat, 8 hours was the appropriate length of time for anybody to work. And then the builders in Melbourne agreed with them until eventually there was a whole cacophony of support until finally on the 21st of April 1856, 8 hours became the official working day. And that was a world first. But why here in Australia? The answer lies in Australia's DNA. It was a country conceived as banishment for England's rejects and born in grim isolation. Brutal rule was met with spirited defiance. The class system had been left behind. Respect was earned, not inherited. And from that, the free workforce freely questioned their plight. What seems to me so bizarre about the struggle for the 8-hour day, the part that seems so truly, madly, deeply Australian, is that when they won it, the workers were given a holiday. In other words, they took time off for getting time off. Here you are, lads. So what the 8-hour day brought Australians was time to play. And play they did. I believe it's one of the reasons this country is so annoyingly good at sport. With the possible exception of cricket. There was even a team representing Indigenous Australia. This team, photographed in 1867, toured England for 6 months. Sadly, they were regarded more as a circus troupe than a serious sportsman. The Daily Telegraph wrote of Australia, Nothing of interest comes from there, except gold nuggets and black cricketers. It took another 30 years before a 10-hour day was established in England. It was a 12-hour day in France, but because of the stonemasons, the Australians had that beautiful balance of 8 hours work, 8 hours play, and 8 hours sleep. For over 2,000 years, sport has been changing our world. And our world has been changing sport. On my time travels, I've witnessed the power of sport to overcome animosity, break down barriers, and bring people together. Which makes me think, for all the glorious victories that have taken place on fields like this, it's what sport has achieved off the field that really matters. Hi, I'm Tony Robinson. If you love my show and want to see some more amazing history stories, then please hit the subscribe button, click the notification bell, and we'll let you know when there's something new to watch. Enjoy.